So, welcome everybody. I guess I want to maybe just go ahead and take a minute to look at as this Q&A that we're doing has these questions from the Pathwork Guide. So, and this was a follow-up to a series of lectures that we have been reading on the cosmology lectures. And so the guide in that lecture had mentioned that he would have a Q&A after that series for people to, really bring out their questions and stuff. And the story was all about, the fall of the angels and the plan of salvation and that kind of thing. So he begins in the Q&A with opening for, questions. And it says, before he actually goes into that, I just want to read one little quote that he says. Oh, I'll share here.
Yeah, I was just gonna ask.
Hold on. Okay, share screen. Okay. So he says, as I've promised, we will have tonight a question and answer session. And he's also saying, I guess this is maybe the first question and answer session that he held, because he said from now on he would be ready to answer personal questions in these general sessions, not only for those that are not coming for private, I guess for people that are not going for private sessions, right? And and he's saying, that's really not an imposition for the listeners, right, to ask personal questions. And I kind of highlighted this because, again, I feel like we want to, really support this idea of risking, sharing, revealing, all of that. And so he says, if you are ready to ask anything personal, of course, only concerning your spiritual development or psychological difficulties, this will help others much more than you can imagine. And rather than taking time away from them by asking such questions, you will offer a gift to the others while you benefit at the same time. And so, it's like, if we can remember that with our questions and stuff in general, I think it's, good. And so then the question that starts off, it says, is, I understand how the fallen spirits, through their longings, created for themselves the earth. But I do not understand why it was necessary to move to a physical planet and have such a very physical and material life in order to achieve this. So the answer, in the first place, physical is merely an indication of the degree of density. Human beings often make the mistake in thinking that, for instance, the world of darkness is not physical, or that the spiritual matter there is of radiant matter. In fact, the substance there is much denser than your physical substance. So I guess the way that the guide is taking this question, is like the person is, thinking that to make the physical world, we're going into a denser substance than we were when we were in the, negative spaces of the fallen spirits. And the guide is saying, no, that there's things can be so dense, right, that we can't see that as well. It becomes invisible and untouchable. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sure I'm going to say the same thing that you might have said. I was trying to picture what exactly that would look like, or how would it feel. I can't really conceptualize. I mean, I understand what he's saying, but I can't really have an idea of what that would look like. How could something be so dense that I can't even feel it? It's interesting.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I can't quite myself, because I can't quite conceive of what the heck, but the thought occurred to me, maybe what he's talking about is what the scientists now talk about as dark matter. Right? We have not been able to detect that. And it has something to do with, both, I think, gravity and with, like I don't know, the expansion contract, I don't know. So, but I don't, yeah, I am with you in the sense of just kind of imagining, like try to imagine that, density could be invisible. Um, I think maybe when you think of, like the black hole,
Right.
that, pulling everything in, maybe, like that, they talk about that as being, this density that takes even light, so you can't see it from
Right.
that standpoint, right? So maybe that's something that is there too.
Suffice it to say, it's probably a dimension and that even our smartest physicists can't really explain.
Right.
You know?
Yeah, we may not know about it yet, what the guy's talking about there. There's a lot of different things too that he talks about on a scientific level that are close to what, since we've understood, but, always from a, a little different perspective. So I'm not always sure, how, like some of the things that the guy talks about, about how, like say animals and plants, right, are less conscious, and I don't know, maybe that's true, but I don't know that we could necessarily say that, it's like, that's how sort of in Eva's generation, things were seen. So I think maybe, that's kind of like something that was part of her conditioning that, was brought there. And they also talk about, some of the things that she talks about around the, lifetimes with, where there's same-sex attraction and that kind of thing, or so there's a whole movement, to, like look at some of the things that the guide is saying, from the context of the times. And I think it's in generally true that every medium, is somewhat influenced and not perfect with it. But there's so many things that she says that are, unique or surprising, or, that I find, I try to work with and try to understand what she's pointing out.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm probably jumping way ahead, but the one
Okay, go ahead.
the one that stood out to be really important in this lecture was when he said that the soul does not take possession of the body until the first breath, until the baby takes the first breath.
Yeah.
And this is like, oh, this goes right to the abortion, argument.
Exactly. Yeah, it's like this was a lecture that did seem to have a lot to do with it, like sort of everything. And what's interesting about it, is like, yeah, like, I mean, and I do believe we have, evolved and advanced, but it's still, is so much the same controversies and issues and, realities. We're still dealing with the remnants and the, kind of the ending, I think, of this era of mankind, right? And so just like in our personal lives, right, the recreations keep running, coming back around, so we can look at them again. So let's see, so he says, well, the more highly developed beings can see and feel. Oh yeah, he's saying, so like, oops, here comes Jasmine. Hi, Jasmine.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
So we're just starting with the lecture a little bit down there. We're on the first question and some of the answers. So just join in whenever you have any questions or anything. So he gets into this thing where, he's saying that the higher the development, the more radiant or finer the degree that matter is. And then the more highly developed beings then can see and feel not only their own substance, but could also see and touch the substance of lower levels, right? But here he's also saying that, we at this level are higher than some of these lower spirits, right? And we cannot see them, right? So I thought it was kind of an interesting little contradiction there that, because he's saying they're too dense for us to see, in some ways. So I think that there's, a way that I get what he's saying, right? Like you see that in levels of human consciousness, right? When I look at humanity, I can see levels of consciousness that are lower than mine. I can't always see, or recognize, to varying degrees, but like all that higher than mine. So, usually, you can recognize where you've come from, what you've developed out of. But then I guess in the incarnational process, right, when we come to the earth plane, even though we're influenced, it can be, by those other more dense beings. It's not necessary, we don't, see them. Some people may have, intimations of them in various ways, but, we don't, are usually they're invisible to us. So, he says, it is a condition of the particular development of the earth sphere that humans generally cannot see any other substance than their very own. The same principle applies to all spheres lower than the earth sphere, but does not apply to higher spiritual spheres. So I guess if you're beyond the earth sphere, then all of the higher spheres can see. One of the particular purposes of this world of matter is that on the earth, you are open for influences of the higher as well as of the lower spheres. And you stand, so to speak, in the middle and can choose. This gives you a much greater chance for faster development. At the same time, you live surrounded by people of different levels of development, which creates friction. It is much easier to live with people of the same spiritual spheres, while the difference of development among different peoples creates misunderstandings, blindness, and so on. This very difficulty can be the key to faster development, because you can certainly overcome your weaknesses faster if they are challenged. And this they are by the frictions and conflicts arising from the differences in outlook and development. So conditions of this earth sphere with its degree of density and circumstance arising from it are certainly more difficult, but therein lies the possibility of infinitely faster development. So, so somehow it got me thinking that, like, also like the part of me that, like reacts or goes into my defense, like if I'm working with somebody that, is less developed, right? Like that, my reaction, they're going to pick up and they're going to react unconsciously to it. And I'm going to realize, like, oh, I have to, not go into my reaction if I want to, really work with this person. So, in that kind of thing, it challenges and builds my own muscle of, like, okay, so let me, step up a level, right? Let me try to, work with this, since, there's more consciousness in me. The guide says, that person has more responsibility in the relationship, right? So it kind of calls us that friction, especially where we have the higher development, to step into it fully.
It's almost like he's saying that by the nature of its intended purpose, the earth could never really be a utopia.
Yeah.
That wouldn't work.
Yeah, it's never gonna be, right? In that sense, especially of the sort of child 100 utopia, right? Like and still, I still watch my like even in the Putin thing, let's just get him out of the way, and everything will be fine, right? It's like it doesn't ever quite work that way. And so there's these, ways that when we just want to, kind of, well, this is good and this is bad, this is right and this is wrong, it often teaches us that things are much more complex than that, right? And we were talking earlier, Frank and I, because, it's hard to not, just really feel like there's a clear right and wrong and good and bad guy here, Um, and it is, like for me, in some ways it's like, oh, now it feels like we're getting sane again, but in some ways, it is a retro thing, right? And so I'm curious to see how it goes, but I certainly do also, feel that there's something in this where, that impulse to do the wrong thing, right? Like the international community has stepped up, I think, in a good way, right? To say, no, this is no longer okay. And so maybe when we get to that one on the war a little bit, we can go into that some more, but it definitely, it brings out sort of my own, wanting to just have everything perfectly right by getting rid of everything perfectly wrong. Right? So another question. He says, I have two questions. One is, do I understand right that because of the special degree of density of the world of darkness, we cannot see it and we cannot touch it? Answer, that is right. It is of an entirely different caliber, of a very different substance. It is not finer than yours, but thicker. It is so thick that you would not call it physical anymore. And that's kind of what reminds me of dark matter or something, Question. The other question is, I believe you said in a lecture once that the spirits who are in darkness actually wince and shrink away and feel physical pain when they come into contact with the light of higher spirits. You said that the lower spirits don't see the higher. And then you said, so there's kind of like another question about a apparent contradiction. So the guide answers, it is this way. As a rule, they cannot see it as a manifestation from the higher worlds. At exceptional occasions, the higher spirits can manifest either in the form of light or in their actual form. If these higher spirits do not take certain measures to manifest, the lower spirits will not see them ordinarily. But if such measures have been taken, the lower beings will see, feel, or perceive in some way the higher beings. The same applies to your world. You may see a materialization or other sights if the spirit world fulfills the requirements and wishes to give such a sign. But ordinarily you will not see it. So if this light then manifests to those spirits in darkness, it creates a pain or discomfort of some kind, again, according to their development or lack of it. Is that clear? Yes, thank you. Question. You said last time that due to the longing of the fallen spirits, gradually this earth sphere came into existence. I always thought God created the world, not the lower spirits. Answer. In the first place, I purposely said that this earth came into existence not only due to the longing of the fallen spirits, but also due to the longing of the higher spirits, who have remained faithful to God and whose longing was directed to the salvation of their fallen brothers and sisters. Their longing also helped to create this world. But this will still not answer your question quite satisfactorily. Whether God created this world or the longing of the spirits, the fallen ones as well as the pure ones, is one and the same thing, my dear. God creates often through his children, through his spirits, through his laws. The spirits cannot create anything unless they are given the power I was speaking of lately, the power that can be used for good or for evil. This creative power, this life force, can be directed into any channel and can create, therefore, worlds of beauty and harmony or worlds of ugliness and pain. You create worlds all the time, every day and every hour, as you know. And as I have said repeatedly, you create spiritual worlds. You do that automatically because the law works in this way. Therefore, God creates through his power, which he has given to his children to use to a wide extent, and through his law that makes this possible. So are there any questions about any of that? I think, like in some ways, he talks about the law, and he goes into a little more, explicitness here with, how we create, he creates through us. And I think people can see that, like the good that comes through humanity and that kind of thing. But he also, creates through this law, which I find is kind of also interesting, right? And so it's sort of like, in some ways, it is these times, right? This law of God has brought us to, this time on earth in some way, right? Where the old tactics, are only causing pain and disharmony and causing, the death of the earth or whatever, so that we're, having to, like sort of learn also through those laws, the karmic laws, or the ways that, we really are co-creating and mutually creating. And so he also goes into that in the thing on the question on the war a little bit. So this material world was and still is being created in the same way as many other spiritual worlds. The coming into existence of this earth was the expression of the attitude of the longing of everything that was and is part of the personalities involved. So, basically, this is just a big cauldron of everything. The higher as well as the lower. The spiritual worlds are nothing else but the expression of their attitudes, their mentality, their longing, their goals, their feelings, their deeds, and thoughts. Is that clear? So, there's this influence of this, and then there's the influence of the lower. Question: is it, so to speak, a co-creation? Answer: no, I would not say a co-creation. You might call it that, but it's not entirely correct. It will give a false idea. Co-creation would mean that God actually went ahead and created himself this world while the other spirits helped and participated in the creation. It is not that way. God created his laws of the universe. He created his children. He created various powers and strengths and forces. And he distributed them in such a way that all living spirits can use this power in free choice. Part of the expression of this power are the various worlds or spheres coming into existence. Question: yes, I understand that, but there is something else. You said that at that time they were not so far developed that they would produce only spheres of light. When I read that, I thought, is anybody now able to produce only spheres of light? Answer: well, there are people now on this earth who belonged once to the light, and partly, let us say, medium spheres, but not dark spheres anymore. At that time, this ability to produce only spheres of light did not exist, unless you take the pure incarnated spirits. And that was the exact reason why pure spirits were incarnated at intervals, so that a communication with the spirit world of God could be established, for which it is necessary that the beings in question do not produce spheres of ugliness and darkness anymore, but have, at least to some degree, spheres of light and harmony of their own. At that time, there were very few of the fallen spirits who had any light spheres. The best they could do was to have, again, I use this word, medium spheres. Of course, all this is so relative. Yes, thank you. Question: how come that for the satanic power, the name Lucifer, which means light bringer, was given? Where is its scriptural origin? The name Lucifer was not given to this spirit after he became what you call Satan. That was his name when he was created as a spirit of light. And as you know, Lucifer came after Christ. He was a marvelous and beautiful spirit, the bringer of light. That name originates from that time. And sometimes I think, like in a way, it's self-consciousness, right? That the Luciferic sphere is that of self-awareness. the light bringer, right? But in the self-awareness, we also created, God is not just, we created the rebellion, so there's this kind of connection, I think, with, I like that, that this bringer, the light bearer, I think is similar to the kind of the egoic consciousness, right? That is the self-awareness turned into selfishness. So. He says where you can find it in scriptures is a question that he's not entitled to answer because we can find it ourselves. And underline any of that, so I'm going to assume that it's not all that relevant. So, question, has Lucifer been incarnated as Christ was? Answer, no, my friends, how could he? Before you can be incarnated, you have to reach a certain development. There are many, many, many other spirits who have not fallen as deeply as Lucifer. So maybe that, blows my theory about Lucifer being, consciousness in that sense. But, he says, I think in some of the other anthroposophical books, they talk about, the Luciferic sphere of consciousness as being, the separated sphere. So I don't know why the light bearer and separation. I mean, that seems more again like the Satan part of the Luciferic sphere. But anyway, like he's basically saying here that Lucifer was really the name when he was a divine angel and not a fallen angel. And then he's saying, no, the fallen part has not ever even incarnated, that it's so dark and, much time will have to elapse before they can get to a level of incarnating. The worst criminals on this earth must have already some sense for good somewhere inside them, for otherwise they could not be human. They would not be ready for incarnation. Lucifer must be the very last to incarnate in theory. And I'm wondering as I'm reading this, like incarnate as in a human being, but in some ways, to me, it's a larger force that's part of the collective of humanity, right? So, it's still, it's not incarnate, in an individual life, but I think it sort of could be considered to be incarnate in the collective in some way. In practice, of course, since he would be the last, his development will proceed in a different way as the others and will not go through this form of human incarnation. If he would be the only man living on earth, there would be no point to it. And he must perforce be the last. The first will be the last. And he was the first to fall, so he must be the last to come back. And he will be the last to come back because he is the furthest away from God in his attitude. So if it were logical for him to be incarnated at all, he would be the last one. But since there would be no purpose for such an incarnation, his development will proceed differently. Okay, and so then we shift a little into, looking at sort of Lucifer and history, right? Questions, and that brings in this whole question about war. So the question is it true that during World War II, there was a danger point also in the battle of the heavens, parallel to the height of power of Hitler before the Russian debacle? Answer, oh no, my friends. Oh no, you see, if there was still a danger point on that score, the salvation through Christ would make no sense. Remember last time, he was saying that once the Christ had, died on the cross and descended into hell, the battle was fought, Christ won. And so the remaining aspects of darkness are here still for us to discern and learn from. But the danger, in a sense, is over. We are, already, Christ achieved and accomplished the mission. So since that war between Christ and Lucifer, and since the salvation, everything is established and runs according to plan. The free will of the individual plays a role in it. There is always enough leeway left for that in both directions. Nevertheless, up to a certain point of development, until they have found a certain spiritual light in an overall development. Collectively, people have wars on your earth. In principle, from a spiritual point of view, the last wars were no worse than the wars you had hundreds and thousands of years ago, because it's not a question of how many people are killed. The question is the motive, and the motives have certainly purified in the latest wars, not only the very last. So, seems like that's a funny paragraph in there. Did I read it correctly? It's talking about the war and the, of Christ, and said that. So that, oh, okay, that was because he was talking about the World War. Now I'm remembering. Okay. So yeah. So then he's just saying that, there's a certain level where war isn't about, the war in heaven or about Lucifer and per se, it is about human development. And sort of on the collective level, he's saying that until we have reached a certain point in our evolution, there will be wars on earth. And he says, if you look from a spiritual point of view, even in some ways, the wars are evolving. And then he goes in and he talks about, how we used to fight sort of blindly for other leaders and stuff like that. Now, usually we're fighting for at least some cause, even if it's diluted, even if it's not accurate, somehow, we believe that, it's necessary or the right thing to do. And not only for just us, but, for something larger. So he says, with that, I do not mean to say that one side is always entirely right and the other is entirely wrong. There is always some wrong on both sides, certainly. And I don't know, I've read some things, I think, for the most part, there were some things that on the West, we also weren't paying attention to, we weren't listening to, we weren't sensitive to, I don't know if that would have made a difference, but certainly there are, certain articles and, people's thoughts on that. That even, and it's like, when we go back and look at Germany and what happened, in terms of the German people, not necessarily Hitler, but, we can kind of recognize that they were in this, place where they were easily carried off into, Hitler's fantasy or whatever, because of their own sort of defeat after World War I, and the, country left in shambles. And so, partly that's why we helped Japan after World War II, trying to rebuild. And that seemed to have worked a little better, right? So, and it's kind of the difference in a way, I think, between, like again, Putin, whose war seems to be just vindictive and cruel and, wanting to punish, versus and eradicate, versus sort of the wars, that are for more ideology, right? So he says, at least there is some ideology behind it, even if there are some ruthless people who are completely selfish. The majority of the people who follow some cause, some idea, while in former times they had to go to war like sheep, their rulers forced them, and they had absolutely no idea why. And it was just the thing to do. And then the more you killed, the greater a hero you were. The rulers simply had their own advantages as their goals, to get more land, to get more power. Though people seem to be that way now too, even the most ruthless ones have deep convictions about their own ideas and ideals, wrong as they may be in themselves. If they weren't completely ruthless today, they could not get away with this anymore and could never induce whole nations to kill each other for their self-interest. Deep down, they know and sense this. There are some people who claim that the old way is still the case today, but they are entirely mistaken. So, this may be kind of a case in point, and in a way like a retro regression is that he's describing this, right? And the way this time, it's like less that people are serfs and chattels and forced to go to war for, their masters, but but the way that the, media and the propaganda and all of that, where people are not told the truth, very, and things are, false flags, and everybody's believing that they are fighting for a cause, even though it's not. It's all fed them to control them. So that to me is, that kind of control, I would say, is evidence of sort of the spirit of that, what I see as the Luciferic consciousness that wants to control things.
But Darlene, it's harder in this day and age with the kind of communications that we have to keep
Thank goodness.
The entire country in the dark. Plenty of Russians know that they're being fed a campaign of misinformation.
Right. But plenty of Americans do too. And it doesn't affect, it's kind of like it's good. I'm glad, but it's like I can imagine that there are still, like the majority of the Russians, and I don't believe that they will rise up against Putin. I don't know, maybe I'll be wrong, but and yeah, you're right, and even like Anonymous has hacked in and showed them what's really going on Russian state media and stuff like that. So, they I think you're right. And again, that shows us the times we're in, right? Like apocalypse, right? It means unveiling. It means you can't hide, you can't get away with this shit anymore. And that's been kind of the response too. Like, they said that the United States is, by calling out from the beginning, the intelligence that they had, was, strategically, revealing things, right? That then kind of affected the whole stance of the European countries, as well as, he couldn't kind of get away with his plot, his original plan. So yeah.
But he's getting away with plenty. And in my opinion, he's getting away with way too much. And this is why I feel that it's the responsibility of the Russian people to put him down.
And who knows, maybe somebody will, but I don't think it will be closer to the oligarchs, or I don't know, somebody more in power than
his generals, some of his, military.
Yeah, maybe crew. So maybe, but it will, that depends on, and again, I don't know, what God's plans are, or what God needs and God wants. And this is where, when it's easy for our minds to, see and sort of judge the picture in a certain way, and the guide is always saying we don't see the whole thing. And he also says in this, it's like, it's not the brutality, or it's not the suffering, or the deaths, or anything like that really matters spiritually. And of course, that's what impacts us. It's hard to believe that's true, in some ways. I don't know, but because that's what pulls on our heartstrings. But to go, to awaken the compassion, and to, have action maybe in something, I think there's been good things we've done, whether there's, to want him dead, or to sort of, like make him the whole thing. I don't know, I feel the same way, I told you, Frank, as you do. But I think what the guide is saying is different. So I'm using the guide's challenge as always to challenge my own duality, right? That I feel like I'm lost in a lot. And I think he's pretty clearly saying here, even with Hitler and, Putin camp, about the same caliber, right? All of the death camps, it's like the guide is saying we can't hate in that same way, or we become what we hate, or we become that which we hate, right? I think Paul Selig talks about, like what we damns us. So it's a tough one. I struggle with it, because I feel the same way you feel, but I think that the guide is asking us to look at it a little deeper. And I find, find the inner Putin stuff kind of, I know there's a truth to that, right? But it seems kind of like a silly exercise, like, but I know one time, it was actually our graduation from court training, and we were up in New York at the Court Institute. John P. was, working with each of us, and like he basically said, find your inner witch, right? To me, and so that wasn't hard, but I had got, I was like, it was an intense period of time, and everything, and being with him, and like I really went to the place where I guess I was Putin. I was about ready to hit the nuclear button, right? But back in those days, I had that level of rage and anger in me, and grew up with, like I hated people in general, against, to me they were the enemy of the non-human planet, right? And so everybody should be annihilated. And of course, I guess the nuclear button would have killed all the animals too, but for me in that moment, I like I was willing, to find that place in me that wanted to do that, that wanted to just annihilate everything, that was because it was so wrong in some
Yeah.
way.
Well, at least at this point in history, there are a lot less countries who are prone to such action. I mean, if this was happening 100 years ago, there'd be a lot of choosing sides going on, and let's pick a side and get in this war, so to speak.
Well, and
You know,
yeah, I know, and it's still like, I mean, I think there is,
but I guess what's keeping that at bay is the nuclear proliferation that's part of the equation.
yeah, there's been this kind of stability for a while, but I think again the old order is breaking down, and hopefully it goes to a better new order. But we may see, some other things, because it's like, I think there really are a lot of people trying to test, like, what are the geopolitical limits for territorial expansion now. And we had kind of like made sure all of the lines on the maps were stable, and we were trying to enforce them. But there's been all of these ethnic cleansings, all these wars everywhere. It's like it's been ongoing, and I think it's kind of like the pressures again geopolitically as we go into this time where the earth is going to be much more difficult to live in. And the wars are for resources, for water, for oil, for maybe we're shifting out of the oil one, and this one will be the last one, I don't know, but it clearly is a part of and has been a part of all the wars. There was a really interesting article, I didn't get to read the whole thing, but it did kind of go back all the way through 9/11, and like all of the geopolitics of what's going on. And I think that really back in 2001 was sort of the turning point of the old order. I think there's a Netflix limited thing on it that I thought was pretty good. But yep, I every time I hear about what's going on, and I see the bravery and the power and the all of the fight that's happening for Ukraine, and prayers are definitely for that country, that that somehow sort of the David and Goliath picture can win the day. And somehow in this overstep, Russia does find is we can put back in its place without too much humiliation, because I think that's where you end up right now with Putin. It's like he doesn't have anything to lose now, so hopefully it can de-escalate. And I saw where Brzezinski or that Ukraine was like backing down too, so it looked like there was some attempts at some negotiation that was real. So I don't know, but it's a big thing that we're experiencing now. And like the guide is saying later on in this lecture, like really it's all our, like we're all a part of it, right? So the other thing that we can do is see where our own wars are happening within us and around us, where we go to war. right? Where we go to war against ourselves, or we go to war against other people around us, even in small ways, like family spats or something like that, right? Maybe we need to see if we can find a place to really embody, like loving kindness, in that heart. And somehow, I guess the guide is asking us to extend that as well. Not an easy one. He talks about praying for our enemies, in that lecture on prayer. So, and then he's saying here, like, let's see where I left off. Let me just try from here. It is true that a sincere but mistaken motive to go to war will not save you from the consequences, because ignorance does not alter the law of cause and effect. But what is absolutely true is that the false motive is not evaluated in the same way as the purely selfish and wicked one. And so there's where I think, to the degree that Putin is, moving from, like sort of his own psychopathy, his own, glory gain, his own personal interest, that he will be judged. I guess just not by us. Therefore, this alone should be an answer to people who claim there is no advance in spiritual development, for there is, and this is one of the many proofs. But, like he was speaking then, like, okay, we've turned the corner and gone kind of retrograde here, but hopefully, again, like you're seeing that the world doesn't stand for it like in the same way. So something has shifted. But people will eventually reach, and it is to be hoped that this will happen in the not too far away future, an understanding that war can never be a solution. There was and is spiritual progress, but not measured by technological progress. The mere fact that technical and material progress has been going on so fast in comparison to spiritual progress will force people to come to this conclusion and this enlightenment. As long as people do not fight their lower selves and thus become enslaved to them and to the powers of darkness, the outer expression of this state will be, among other things, war. But when this fight in individual and personal development will have reached a certain stage, when people have reached a step nearer to God in a certain definite way, wars will not be possible anymore. If only a certain percentage of human beings, by no means even half of the world population, but only a small part, 1/10, perhaps not even that, would really follow the spiritual development and purification I advocate, overcoming their own lower trends, recognizing in self-honesty their own lower nature, and thus finishing the war that is raging in almost every human soul, the outpouring of energy forms in the form of welfare will cease to exist. Warfare will cease to exist. There's hardly a person, even in this room, in whom a war is not going on inside, a war that is not recognized as yet, where one trend of the subconscious wants to go this way and the other that way, and your unconscious does not know it. This creates wars on this earth. Your unrecognized hatred, your unrecognized selfishness, your unrecognized lack of love, and so on. Once you control this, it does not mean you have to be completely purified, but you control it, you are aware of it, even if only less than 1/10 of the entire human population will reach that stage. I assure you, war will be impossible. But to say that this war was created because of the war of the spirits cannot possibly be right. Any comments, questions? So are we to understand that it does not matter so much how many people are killed and that this is not regrettable? Answer, My dear friend, this depends entirely on the way you look at it, from what point of view. As far as you human beings are concerned, you should be very responsible, and not only about the life of your fellow creatures, but also their well-being. It is your responsibility. So certainly you should never adopt the point of view that what happens to others does not matter. This distortion may serve people's lowest instincts. It is your sacred duty, just as it is to do your best for your own development, for your own life, also to be concerned with the life of every other person. In some way, you are bound to everyone else, even your worst enemy. That person is you, and you are that person. But from the spiritual point of view, the question, how many people were killed in a war, is not the important matter. The important matter is what the motive is, how the spiritual attitudes of everyone involved look to us. Also, you must not forget that the clockwork of the laws is so perfect that nothing unjust can come to any single individual. That does not mean that you are free to commit sins, to be careless about the lives of others by leaning heavily on the fact that no injustice can happen to anyone anyway. You cannot do injustice to another being, but you can harm yourself by violating the laws of love. I thought that was a very beautiful response there. So again, questions about, is the Antichrist incarnated now? And no, definitely not, if by this is meant one particular Antichrist. Of course, all spirits who come from the world of darkness and who are still entrapped in that darkness are all Antichrists. And everyone who does not see the light of God and the light of Christ and the light of goodness, love, and truth is an Antichrist. In that sense, yes, they are still that, but they will not always be. They may be instruments consciously or unconsciously of the worlds of darkness, but there is no particular single incarnation representing the Antichrist. So the idea that existed for a time that Hitler was the Antichrist is wrong. Answer: it is entirely wrong. Hitler came from the world of darkness. That is quite true. But particularly in the case of Hitler, the chances were that he could have done well in this life. Before he was incarnated, he was in a certain school in the spirit world. He had, through previous incarnations, deserved certain merits, and even though he was still very much connected with the world of darkness, these merits warranted that he be given certain instructions. Therefore, he came to earth. He was told that he would, by a conglomeration of many circumstances that all play into the divine laws, be given great power, and it would be according to his free will how he would use this power. He even had a great deal of psychic power. Up to a certain point, the chances were there that he might have used these powers in a good way. That may surprise you. I do not mean by that that he would have become a savior, a saint, or anything like that. Of course not. He was much too bound to the world of darkness for that. Not enough developed by far. But he could have gained some progress in his spiritual development. He could have overcome some of the darkness that was still in his soul, and he could have done some good. Yet he was weak, and he did not take this chance. He used his powers first only a little, unwittingly, and then more and more for the powers of darkness. But that was not determined from the beginning. There was a certain time in his life, in his youth, and we can see this picture now, when he was almost at the point of going over the borderline. He just did not quite make it. And once entangled only a little with the powers of dark powers, he could never muster the strength anymore to disentangle himself from them. So he was not a Lucifer by any means. He could not have lived on earth in the first place if he were anything like it. And particularly in his case, more than in many of the others that surrounded him, who were much darker spirits. The very strong inclination existed, comparatively speaking, to strive upward, to reach into the world of God. If you were to study his life thoroughly, you would find many indications that would confirm my words. In other words, he was a tragic figure. Yes, much more tragic than some others. And then he goes into Mussolini. Again, I don't know, is this interesting to you all? We can read through, but some of this, and then he was talking about Nostradamus's prophecies. And how, not all prophecies are, going to come true. I guess you want to go back on that one? He says, may I ask in this connection about Nostradamus, who has prophesied some of these events? Isn't that impossible to do over 400 to 500 years? Answer, no, it is not impossible, because any great seer, and they are never quite entirely right, you will understand why, can at times be allowed to see the plan that exists in the spirit world. Or perhaps due to some particular talent and personal vibration, one can be tuned in, so to speak, to see a part of such a plan. So some of us that, might have precognitive dreams or something like that too, God makes the plan according to given circumstances, always within the framework of the law. But there are several plans, meeting all eventualities resulting from free will. Different timelines, right? Either one will come true or another, or still another, varying only slightly in the time element in certain conditions. But the plan must be made and prepared for all possible decisions resulting from free will. This is an important part of the plan of salvation. We know that a certain number of possibilities are open. We give leeway for all these possibilities when the time comes to work from our end. Now, it sometimes happens that a seer sees just one such plan. If later the free will of the individuals involved will have led up to the fulfillment of this plan, the seer was right. Otherwise, this may account for his mistakes, although other circumstances may also play a role in that, such as a false interpretation of what was seen. So the prediction of Nostradamus for the end of this century does not have to come true. Not necessarily. That's why I was asking whether this can be avoided. Answer,
Do you
certainly.
happen to know what that prediction is?
Not exactly. I mean, there's many predictions, and in Nostradamus's, quatrains, they're not even really put in a timeline. So I don't know how somebody thinks they know. But there are certain ones that, they kind of think are pointing to this and that. And so I think that he's probably talking about those. And but I'm not sure what specific ones they are. So again, it's just kind of this discussion about, like sometimes seers see things and sometimes they can be wrong, right? And certain talent of seership, particular wavelengths, tuning in, and then the question, can deep-seated psychological problems pertaining to a previous life be solved by human methods of hypnosis alone, or does it need regression? So this is a separate type of question going into hypnosis. And he says, you mean whether certain problems resulting from a former life can be solved without becoming aware of them? Yes, that depends very much on the case. There are many, many cases where the psychological problems can be solved without regression, without the knowledge of the particular incarnation involved. But there are instances where this knowledge is an absolute necessary factor, where the problem can be solved thoroughly only if this knowledge is made available. But these cases are in the minority. The guide has said in other places too, we really, the issues are brought into this life and are, activated in this life. And so if we focus on what's here in this life, it's still, addressing the past life things, just not within that context. So most of the time, we work our past lives through the present life circumstances. However, he does say that sometimes, something more is required. So he wants to add this, only if the person in question undergoes the strictest process of self-development and purification Only if the steepest and most direct path is taken, should or even can such knowledge be made available without harm. So, it's protection that we don't know these things, as the guide has mentioned this before too. Then the spirit world of God will interfere, will direct and help with the right timing and the proper and necessary guidance, and see to it that not more than just certain sectors of knowledge are brought back. Otherwise, there would be no point in taking away your memory when you are born on this planet. So, in general, this amnesia serves a purpose. And I know a lot of people, seem to have past life recollections and stuff. And I sort of like, there's a therapist, who kind of says, well, it really doesn't matter, if it's an accurate past life. It's still the unconscious revealing, something about what its issues are. So it can be worked, just like anything else in our fantasies or our memories or whatever, And so oftentimes when we do past life regression kinds of things in the path work, I know when I do them, I don't know if it's a real past life, but, I'm following in my being a feeling, right? That is sort of seems to be a old soul dent or something like that. And then, kind of rolling it back in time to imagine like, well, what kind of life would bring that feeling out in me, right? So, and that can be fun and useful and kind of get another perspective on things. But I think, probably not as many people as think they know about their past lives as do. All that you hear today about previous incarnations and knowledge that is supposed to be so easily available should not be believed, my friends. It is one of the hardest, most difficult things to accomplish. The world of God guards this knowledge very carefully. This knowledge can never come to you, be it through hypnosis or through mediumship, without the spirit world of God. And the later will not lend a helping hand if there is not a very good spiritual reason. If this knowledge serves the purpose of further purification, then without this knowledge, this further and utmost purification cannot be accomplished quite successfully. It should not be taken merely as a cure, let alone to satisfy personal curiosity. It must be taken as a heavy piece of responsibility. The person should think and feel somewhat like this. If I learn certain factors about previous lives, then I have the duty to fulfill even more in my own development and in what I have to give to God. This knowledge must be the material for further self-purification, nothing less. And before this knowledge is made available, this attitude has to be proven already, at least to some extent. It will not be made available unless it is proven that the person is following this path. Now, as to the technical and practical procedure with regression and hypnosis, here it is my very strong and definite advice that it should never be undertaken without God and Christ. Both the subject and the hypnotist should feel themselves to be instruments and should surrender to God and ask for guidance and inspiration. Otherwise, it may be either fake and thus having no meaning whatsoever in the life of the person, or even dangerous. But if it is undertaken in the proper attitude, then the spirit world of God will help and will, among other things, show the hypnotist how to go about it. There are no definite rules that can be applied with everyone in the same way. It depends very much on the case, on the individual. Therefore, it has to be done differently with everyone. And only the spirits of the world of God are in a position to see into the soul, to know how much knowledge this person can digest without shock, how the timing and the procedure should be handled. Only the soul is capable of conducting this operation. It can do so if the hypnotist is open to this guidance and inspiration. Such a hypnotist will also have to go through a particular training of this sort. This kind of hypnosis must be handled entirely differently than ordinary hypnosis. And never should one start with hypnosis. Only after much progress as what has been achieved by other approaches and psychological problems that can be handled without such regression, in purification, in uncovering the subconscious trends for the purpose of harmony in the soul. Only after some considerable progress of spiritual development, emotional maturity, and stability, only then should this treatment be started. If God has given the answer, as always in this matter, just as in others, I would be very happy occasionally to give advice in more specific form. So this is kind of reminding me, I went to Brazil one time, and there was a medium there that was leading the group, or present for the group events. And when we first got there, she kind of went around the circle and sort of was reading people and offering them something. And in several instances, it was, past life reflections. And of course, I was like really hoping that this would, be an important, breakthrough and, teaching for me and stuff like that. But I, always struggle in new things and groups and stuff like that. And it was really very, very appropriate, but difficult also at the time. But basically when she got to me, she basically said, that I had had a very difficult recent past life, and that was, the cause of, my difficulties. But she said that, they were telling her that no more information could be shared, right? And so, I've always sort of trusted that in a way as well, and not worried about such things too much. But I think, it's the same thing the guide is saying here, right? It's done in certain circumstances, but it's an important thing, and I really do feel like in some ways that, yeah, this life is full of grace, from something that, may have been, not so easily. And so, like we want to focus on where we are, be here now, and everything we need is here in this life. So question, you have told us how difficult it is for the spiritual world to prepare a spirit for incarnation in our world. The fluids have to be changed and so on, even in the case of a newborn baby that dies after 2 days. Why all this work for nothing? Oh, the work is not for nothing. The mother has to go through a karma, and this little baby will be given to another mother. Immediately? Certainly. It will not go back to the spirit world. It will be brought immediately to the mother who was chosen for it in the first place. For in the spirit world, it is known that the first mother has to go through this karma. This unhappiness is in her plan that she has somehow sown before, and now she has to reap. It is good for her development, and she thus pays off a debt. You all know what the implication of tests and unhappy occurrences are. But the work is not for nothing, for all this is figured out and planned beforehand, and arrangements are made before the first birth. And this infant is carried to the mother it was destined for in the first place. Question, how would that hold true for an infant that has not developed, just started in a miscarriage? In such a case, there is no spirit there as yet. The spirit takes possession the moment the first cry is uttered. You say, and I have heard it from others too, that the spirit takes possession only after the first cry has been uttered. But it has been known that in some cases the person could remember hearing the parents talking while it was still in the womb. Answer, I see what you mean, but that does not mean the child was in the womb. The child is not in the womb at that time. It is outside, a spirit. Of course, among human beings, there are these arguments about various matters where one school of thought claims one thing and another the opposite, and you will never agree. I will tell you the way it is. You can believe it or not. It is not correct that the spirit takes over at the time of conception. The movement in the womb is an automatic one. As I have already mentioned before, it is caused by the bloodstream of the mother in order that the limbs will not atrophy. It is necessary, but merely a technical procedure, so to say. If such memories occur, it may be in a rare instance that the spirit prepared for birth is awake at short intervals and then retains such memories. It may be close to parents in this period, but it is even more likely that this baby happens to be very psychic, clairvoyant, or clairaudient. After birth, it can perceive and remember certain forms. You know that thought creates forms in the spirit world, and the child perceives them afterwards. It may also be that other spirits repeat the same words after the birth, and the child can hear and remember them. Such incidents may happen and are allowed to happen occasionally to show humans that life does not originate on this earth plane. But then people often misinterpret this in another wrong way. Namely, like in this instance, that this is the memory from the time the child was in the womb. Humankind ignores the many complicated and involved possibilities with these things. It's interesting to me, this answer, because it's a lot of the trauma work that started early on went into sort of the rebirthing and the birth trauma stuff, right? And so like the guide is really saying, and a lot, like a lot of traditions talk about, even there's a pathwork helper that really works with birth trauma and also, the child before it incarnates, bringing it in and helping it, so I'll have to listen to Allison's talk again. And see if she references this, because I hadn't remembered reading this when I was listening to her, but and I think she's dealing also with the trauma of going through Stan Groff talks about the different stages of where you can get stuck in the birth canal, and that has and maybe there's a difference between sort of a body trauma, because it is a kind of life and death process, where, it's the body's reacting rather than a soul or something. I don't know, but interesting. Question. I would like to ask something about the idea of Aramat. And he basically says he's answered that question before in another lecture. So I was kind of hoping he would say something more about it there again, but he says, just to repeat, that it's also a spirit who had once very high standing in the world of God, and who also participated in the fall. And Lucifer has given the spirit the authority for this earth sphere, for the world of matter. So it's the materializing influence for this particular substance. As much power as the spirit has, he is still a part of the Luciferic world. To deny this is a great error. So, and a part of, sort of the material, like the lack of faith in God, the lack of, seeing anything beyond this world, is part of this materialism. Part of it is our investment in all of our machineries of war, right? All of that kind of thing. And then the question about the Pistis Sophia, which somebody must have been studying that came to those early things, because there's a couple of Q&As about that, and he addresses that in one of the lectures too. And then a question about what Jesus meant when he said to Peter, "Thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. And I will give thee the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever thou shalt loose on earth shall be bound in heaven." The meaning is this: Jesus entrusted Peter with his teachings, that he might organize the spreading of his teachings. Now, it is a well-known fact that the Catholic Church builds on the belief that from the time on everything is so settled that nothing this church says could be wrong, based on this saying you quoted. And here I do want to explain this. What Jesus meant was that Peter should spread the teachings exactly as he brought them, but that definitely included a communication with the spirit world of God. This communication existed very actively at that time, the time of the first Christians. Jesus was much too wise to suggest that any truth could be kept undiluted by spreading from one human being to another, from one generation to another. He knew that human failings are still much too great to let errors and false interpretations slip in, and to not speak of the danger of the twisting of the truth the world of darkness has always aimed for, and which will succeed as long as there are unpurified beings on this earth. Therefore, direct communication with the world of God is the only way possible. Unfortunately, human beings have sometimes ignorantly, sometimes deliberately misinterpreted these words, as they have many others for that matter. If these words had been taken in their true sense, exactly as Jesus had taught, and as Peter had meant, then, which included such a communication with the world of God, many things would have been different in your human history. I know this will shock some friends, but I cannot help it. This is the truth. And if you read the Bible with true understanding and openness, you will find many, many instances where the sayings of Jesus cannot be interpreted in any other way. As a matter of fact, you will see, particularly from the lectures my friends will start now, that this is so. You have one demonstration there that Jesus always meant you to contact his spirits of truth. It was part of Jesus' teachings that Peter was supposed to spread, and also, which was not published or later taken out, how to go about it. What the laws are to have communication with the spirits of light and truth. And when it was said that Jesus appeared to his disciples after his death, it was also a form of communication. There are many different forms. Later on, Jesus would not appear himself anymore, but sent his emissaries. And when he said before his death, there are many things I cannot tell you as yet, but will tell you later. How do you imagine he could tell you that? Unless through such a communication for which certain laws have to be obeyed and certain conditions prepared. This was an integral part of his teachings. That was, unfortunately, for various reasons, not maintained or even distorted. Furthermore, this quotation means that anyone, then or now, who binds himself to God through adhering to the teachings of Jesus that Peter was to maintain, spread, and organize, would also be bound to the Father in the kingdom of heaven and could never be lost anymore. But anyone who refuses these teachings and loosens himself thus further from God will also be lost after death, not forever, but as long as this attitude prevails. This inner declaration to put God above everything else and follow his will in every respect marks a decisive step in the development of a soul. Sometimes this is called an initiation. This is the meaning of it in essence, and certainly not that God in Christ would only manifest through one human church organization, which alone should be immune to human failings and thus to the influence of the powers of darkness. This would make no sense. Whoever follows the real teachings of Christ and seeks the development and purification through which it is possible to hold the laws of God is indeed immune to all evil. Hell will not prevail and will thus gain the kingdom of heaven. But that is the only way that this can happen. The only way, my friends. And I believe that this must make sense to you. So this also reminds me a little of the separate kingdom that Paul Selig talks about, in this 5D. They're talking about moving from 3D to 5D, right? And I think in some ways it is like through the purification, a shift up into that communion and into that place where that communion and influence and communication is possible. Any questions, any comments? I guess we're coming to the close here.
Hi, Darlene, I have a question. Can you sort of touch on in this answer what he means by God's will when he says his will?
Good question.
Yeah, to me, it seems like I wanted to ask it before, when we were talking about the war going on. To me, it seems like there are many different ways. So are all the ways God's will? Like, I'm a little confused by that.
Yeah, no, it's a very deep question. And in some ways, I think, it's true that what is God's will, right? It wouldn't happen. But I think, that's where it's, God's will in the sense of, it's the best we can do. God's always, will is always towards greater love, greater truth, greater, following of the laws. And so, any given moment, we're falling far short of that, but we're as far along as we possibly can be. And we have to be there to go to the next step. So to surrender and accept what is a part of, I think living really in alignment with God's will. And then I think the other thing is, just that, he's saying there is a state of consciousness, who we really are is our higher self. And that's really what the whole purpose of the path is for us to activate the indwelling God consciousness within us, really. And from that place, it's a state of consciousness where we are in communion and we are naturally loving, and we are naturally able, like in a given moment, like if we don't go to our defense when something happens, and stay open and neutral, we could be inspired by Holy Spirit, to offer something, for healing, for help, so, we become servants, instruments of God in that way, is sort of my understanding of the final destiny of that. And in the journey along the way, we just have to do our best to accept and forgive the shortcomings and the limitations that are, still within our co-creation, our mutual co-creation. So,
Mhm. Yeah, a thought popped up in regards to when you were explaining all of this was that I suppose there are some certain divine laws. So whatever's happening on the earth is within those laws, and perhaps that is what God's will is.
exactly.
I have another question. Earlier, the guide says that, injustice cannot be done. However, he also says that, you can't willingly choose to inflict evil or, not evil, but like,
It won't help you if you do. Yeah.
yeah, like
Won't
you.
hurt anybody else, but it's better
So,
not to.
so if I decide to harm somebody, I'm actually not harming anybody, but I'm harming myself.
Yes, that's ultimately what he's saying. There's another lecture on, the pain of injustice. He goes into this a little more, and another things too, where he talks about in mass movements and things like that. Each person will be affected based on their level of consciousness, right? And how they, and it's there to be experienced, to learn and grow from, right? And so, if I'm, able to, stay in Christ consciousness in a way, then I will not be harmed by that, right? To the degree that I'm not able to stay in Christ consciousness, I might be affected by it, right? But ultimately, it's not my responsibility. And, if I do not return in kind, or, like get tempted into a lower state, right? But do surrender and forgive, and allow, then I think it's, that movement causes me to evolve, right? And you know, I can't be harmed. And even if somebody kills me, like, or rapes me or murders me or whatever, in that situation, right? My spirit, is, my soul is not culpable for that, right? So I'm not really harmed on the spiritual level. My body can be harmed, right? Maybe I can die, but within the context of the destiny of the life path, we don't know. Maybe that was part of the karmic plan that we had chosen, right? So there's a kind of way that we can't really say that, we're ever hurt by anybody else, but we can cause damage to our own soul. Is that clear as mud? That's a tough one too.
No, I think it makes sense. Sorry, I have one more question. So if damage is caused to the body, doesn't that carry over essentially to your spiritual self? Or the damage only carries over when you're still within your lower self?
I think more like that, like I think, if your physical body is damaged and then you identify, with that damage, then maybe, you carry it into the spiritual form. Or maybe if you feel resentment from the damage, that your spiritual form contorts into a resentment monster, right? That damages your soul, right? Does that help?
I think so.
Like I think you're talking about like the perispirit, right? And so there is a form, supposedly spiritually, after life that we still have. And if the body, has a karmic injury or something, sometimes, that it continues on in the perispirit, or, if we're still identified with a pain state, right? it's like, it's about consciousness again. And in the soul form, right, it's almost instantaneous, like you've seen how babies go from, being totally, freaked out and crying and like the world's coming to an end, and then the next minute they're, smiling and laughing, right? It's kind of like that, it's like you're in a certain state, and it just, can shift 180 degrees almost instantaneously, and you're fine. So I think that
That makes sense. I think I kind of get it. Yeah.
and again, this, I don't know that the guide speaks to all of this, so I'm drawing on some of my understanding of some of this other spiritist doctrine stuff, but it's like we don't know for sure. These are just things that people have picked up and sort of talked about. So sometimes these Q&As, I mean, I think it's kind of interesting to speculate, and sometimes it's even useful, like when he talks about like certain attitudes won't go to heaven, right? It's like maybe our spirit goes to heaven, but if we have a negative pissy attitude about something, that attitude's probably going to stay at its vibrational level, right? It can't raise in vibration because of where it's at, and so it can only be in that level of vibration. So when we think of things in vibrational levels, that makes sense too. So to be with God, and not be in a lower realm, we have to be in our hearts, in our higher self, in our higher vibrational spaces.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think I do understand a little bit of that. Thank you.
Okay. So there was something that I remember I was going to say, but I can't remember what it was now. So like, I guess anybody else, I think that should cover us for today.
Yeah,
says
thanks, Charlene.
Yeah. I'll read his blessing here, and we'll close for the evening. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And it says, and now, my friends, I will retire into my world, and I am leaving you with a particular blessing for each one of you. May it give you the strength to find yourself truly, and thus live in bliss and joy. Be joyful, for whoever is seeking God through his own good and sincere will has all the reason in the world to have joy in his heart. Be in peace, be in God.
Thank you, darling.
Okay, thank
Good
you.
night,
And you might take a
everybody.
look at 12, lecture number 12 has like a thing on war too. You might want to check out a little.
Okay.
Okay,
Good night.
Thanks.
night.
Good night.